The house on the edge of Blackthorn Forest had been abandoned for over 50 years. At least, that's what everyone in the village said. Its crumbling walls and shattered windows were hidden behind vines and gnarled tree branches that clawed at the structure like the skeletal fingers of the forest itself. No one dared to go near it, not even the bravest teenagers, fueled by dares and cheap beer. Rumors swirled, each more terrifying than the last. A family that disappeared overnight, their belongings untouched, but their voices echoing in the night. A weeping woman seen staring from the attic window. And the most unsettling tale of all, the one whispered after too many drinks or during thunderstorms when the power flickered, the embrace. They called it the Phantom's Embrace. Those who dared to step foot inside the house were said to feel a presence, cold and suffocating, wrapping around them like a pair of arms. No one could agree on what happened next, because no one who claimed to have felt it ever spoke of it again. Some left the village entirely. Others grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, their minds unraveling. But when Callum moved into the village, he dismissed the stories as drunken ramblings of bored locals. He was 28, a skeptic and desperate for an escape from the suffocating routine of city life. A small-town fixer-upper sounded like the perfect project, and the price of the Blackthorn house was so low it was almost insulting. The house felt wrong the moment he crossed the threshold. The air was heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang, like rusted iron or blood left too long in the sun. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room, pulling in corners where no light could reach. But Callum chalked it up to years of neglect and his overactive imagination. By the second night, the dreams began. They weren't nightmares, not exactly. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, with the sensation of being held. Not gently, though. The arms were strong, unyielding, their grip bruising. He could almost feel the breath against his neck, cold and rancid. The third night, he woke to find bruises on his arms. Perfect outlines of fingers, as if someone or something had gripped him tightly. That's when he set up the cameras. Callum was no paranormal enthusiast, but he believed in logic. If something was happening in the house, he'd catch it on film. He rigged the living room and hallway with cheap motion-activated cameras and set up his laptop to monitor them. The first few hours were uneventful. Just the hum of the old house, settling, and the occasional scurry of mice in the walls. But at 3:12 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted. Callum could see his breath clouding in front of him as he stared at the laptop screen. The hallway camera flickered, static crackling, before the image returned. Something moved. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint distortion at the edge of the frame. But then the figure came into focus, a silhouette, tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Callum froze. The figure didn't walk. It glided. Slowly, deliberately, it made its way down the hallway toward the living room. Toward him. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. All he could do was watch as the figure stopped just outside the door, its featureless face turning toward the camera. And then it vanished. But the embrace wasn't over. Callum barely slept after the figure vanished from the camera. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs, his breath shallow as though he were suffocating. He replayed the footage over and over, hoping the static had tricked his eyes, but no. There it was. A figure, no more than a shadow, moving toward him with that inhuman glide. At dawn, he grabbed his phone and dialed his sister, Lucy. She had always been the practical one, the one who would believe him without dismissing him as crazy. "Get out of that house, Callum," she said immediately, her voice sharp with urgency. "I don't care how cheap it was. No house is worth this." "I can't," he murmured, pacing the dusty kitchen. "Not yet. I need to know what's going on here. I can't just run." Lucy let out a frustrated sigh. "You're going to get yourself killed. Or worse." That last word lingered, but Callum brushed it off. He wasn't ready to leave, not yet. Something about the house had its claws in him. Something he couldn't explain. By the time darkness fell again, Callum was exhausted but resolute. He barricaded himself in the living room, armed with a flashlight, a kitchen knife, and his laptop. He kept the cameras rolling, hoping to capture more evidence, something that might explain the presence that gripped the house. At first, the hours passed quietly. The occasional creak of floorboards and the distant hoot of an owl outside were the only sounds. But at precisely 2:47 a.m., the atmosphere shifted. The smell came first, rotten, putrid, as though something had died and been left to fester in the walls. Callum gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve. Then came the cold, sharp and biting, wrapping around him like icy fingers. And then the sound, a faint whisper, so low it was almost imperceptible. It came from the hallway, growing louder, though the words were indistinct. It wasn't one voice, it was many, layered, overlapping, desperate. Some screamed, others wept, and a few hissed words he couldn't understand. Callum clutched the knife, his hand trembling. His laptop screen flickered, the live feed from the hallway camera showing static interspersed with brief, distorted images. A shadow moved again, this time closer, faster. Suddenly, the living room door creaked open. Callum's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't locked it, but he was sure he had closed it earlier. The hinges groaned as the door swung wider, revealing nothing but the dark hallway beyond. And then he felt it. The arms. They came from behind, wrapping around him in a crushing embrace. The sensation was cold and clammy, the grip impossibly strong. He gasped, struggling, but the more he fought, the tighter it held him. His chest felt like it was being compressed, his ribs groaning under the pressure. Callum's flashlight dropped to the floor, the beam spinning wildly. For a brief moment, it illuminated the far wall, and he saw them, dozens of faces. Pale, translucent, their mouths open in silent screams. They pressed against the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, their forms writhing as though trapped in the very fabric of the house. He couldn't scream. He couldn't breathe. The embrace tightened until he thought his bones would snap. And then it stopped. The arms released him so abruptly that he stumbled forward, collapsing to his knees. He gasped for air, clutching his chest as his vision swam. The room was silent again, save for the faint hum of the cameras. When he looked back at the laptop, the live feed was normal. No shadowy figure, no faces in the walls. But when he checked the footage from the last few minutes, the screen went black at the exact moment the door had opened. Callum didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he searched the house from top to bottom. He needed answers. In the attic, buried beneath a pile of mildewed blankets, he found it, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was spidery and frantic, the ink smudged as though written in haste. The entries were dated over a century ago, and they told the story of a man named Elias Crow, the house's original owner. Elias had been a recluse, a widower consumed by grief after losing his wife and daughter to illness. He wrote her trying to contact them, to bring them back through seances and rituals. The final entries grew more disjointed, rambling about a doorway he had opened and a presence that had come through. They are here now. They will not leave, and neither will I. The last page was smeared with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. By the fifth night, Callum's resolve had begun to crack. The bruises on his arms had darkened, new ones appearing each morning. The dreams had returned, more vivid and violent. In them, he was dragged through endless corridors by unseen hands, the walls closing in until he could barely move. That night, he set up more cameras, determined to capture everything. He stayed awake, knife in hand, waiting. At exactly 3 a.m., the entire house shuddered. The walls groaned, the windows rattled in their frames, and the air filled with that putrid stench again. Then the whispers began, louder this time, almost deafening. The door to the living room slammed shut, and Callum felt the temperature plummet. His breath came out in icy clouds as the shadows in the room deepened, swallowing the faint light from his flashlight. And then in the corner of the room, he saw it. The figure from the hallway. It was closer now, its shape more defined. Its limbs were grotesquely long, its head lolling to the side as though its neck had been broken. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. Callum backed away, his back hitting the wall. The knife slipped from his trembling hand. The figure tilted its head, and for the first time, he saw its face, or what was left of it. Sunken eye sockets, a gaping maw that stretched too wide, and skin that seemed to writhe as though something beneath it was trying to escape. And then it spoke, but its voice wasn't its own. It was a cacophony of voices, men, women, children, all speaking in unison. "You opened the door. You let us in. Now, you belong to us." Callum's knees buckled, and he slid to the floor, his back pressed against the cold wall. The thing. No, the thing stood in the corner of the room, their many voices echoing in his ears like a hellish choir. His mind screamed for him to run, to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, paralyzed by the crushing weight of their gaze. The air thickened, suffocating him as the figure inched closer. Its limbs moved unnaturally, joints bending in ways no human body could manage. Its grotesque face twisted as it leaned down toward him, the hollow sockets where its eyes should have been locking onto his. Callum whimpered, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the room grew darker, the shadows pulsating as though alive. From those shadows, others began to emerge, more figures, more faces, all equally horrifying. They crawled out of the walls, dragging themselves across the floor with skeletal hands, their hollow eyes fixated on him. One of them spoke, its voice low and guttural. "You stayed. You ignored the warnings. Now you are ours." Callum tried to crawl backward, but there was nowhere to go. The wall behind him seemed to soften, the plaster rippling as though it were breathing. He turned his head, horrified, as a pale hand emerged from the wall, its fingers curling around his shoulder. "No!" he screamed, swatting at the hand, but another emerged, and then another, until dozens of hands were gripping him. They pulled at him, dragging him toward the wall. His screams grew louder as the wall itself began to change. It wasn't solid anymore. It was flesh-like, pulsating and wet. Faces pushed through its surface, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes pleaded with him, as though they were trapped and begging for release. The figures in the room circled him, their voices rising in a deafening chant. The words were foreign, ancient, but they carried a weight that filled the air with dread. Callum struggled against the hands pulling him, but his strength was fading. He managed to grab the knife he had dropped earlier and slashed wildly at the hands gripping him. The blade connected, but instead of cutting, the flesh seemed to absorb it. The knife was pulled from his grip, disappearing into the wall. "You cannot fight us," one of the figures hissed. "You invited us in?" Callum shook his head frantically, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't invite anything. I just bought this house." The figures laughed, a cruel, echoing sound. "The house is the invitation. It was always meant to lure you, to lure all of you." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The house wasn't haunted. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that fed on anyone foolish enough to cross its threshold. The hands pulled harder, and Callum felt his body sinking into the wall. His skin burned as it made contact with the flesh-like surface, the sensation like being submerged in ice and fire at the same time. He screamed again, but his voice was swallowed by the chorus of whispers and laughter around him. He clawed at the floor, his nails scraping against the wood, but it was no use. The wall consumed him inch by inch, his legs disappearing first, then his torso. As his chest sank into the pulsating surface, he felt something cold and slimy wrap around his heart, squeezing. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the face of the figure leaning over him. Its gaping mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and its voice filled his mind one final time. "Welcome home." When the sun rose the next morning, the house stood silent and still. The cameras Callum had set up remained intact, their red recording lights blinking steadily. But there was no sign of Callum. The villagers noticed his absence a few days later, but none of them dared to enter the house to investigate. They knew better. A week later, a young couple drove into the village, their car packed with boxes and furniture. They stopped at the local diner to ask for directions, their smiles bright and oblivious. "We just bought the old house by Blackthorn Forest," the man said cheerfully. "It needs a little work, but it's a great deal." The waitress froze, her eyes wide with horror. She opened her mouth to warn them, but the couple was already on their way, eager to move into their new home. The villagers said nothing as the car disappeared down the dirt road. They knew it was already too late. Inside the house, the walls shifted slightly, as if the entire structure was sighing in anticipation. The whispers began again, soft and patient. The house was hungry, and it wouldn't have to wait long. Emma and Luke were thrilled with their purchase. The house, though weathered and overgrown, had a charm that spoke to Emma's love of vintage architecture. Luke, the practical one, saw the opportunity to renovate and resell for a profit. To them, the peeling wallpaper, creaking floorboards, and eerie atmosphere were just challenges to overcome. "This place has so much potential," Emma said, twirling in the dusty living room. The beams of sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows illuminated the dust motes swirling around her. Luke smiled, setting down a box marked kitchen. "Yeah, potential to scare the hell out of us. We'll have to gut most of this." As they unpacked, neither noticed the faint, rhythmic creaking of the upstairs floorboards. Nor did they see the shadow that lingered in the corner of the hallway, just out of the sun's reach. That evening, they celebrated with takeout and cheap wine, their laughter echoing through the hollow house. The unease Emma had felt earlier, the subtle sense of being watched, faded with each sip of wine. "Cheers to new beginnings," Luke said, clinking his glass against hers. By midnight, they were asleep in their sleeping bags, the upstairs bedroom too damp and dusty to use just yet. At 2:33 a.m., Emma woke suddenly, her heart pounding. She lay still, staring up at the dark ceiling, trying to understand what had roused her. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and carried a faint metallic smell she couldn't place. And then she heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't clear at first, just a soft, indistinct murmur. But as Emma strained to listen, she realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered and overlapping, some sobbing, some laughing, others speaking words she didn't understand. "Luke," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up!" Luke groaned, rolling onto his side. "What is it? Do you hear that?" He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. The whispers had stopped. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. "I don't hear anything," he muttered. "Go back to sleep. It's probably just the wind." Emma wasn't convinced, but she lay back down, wrapping her sleeping bag tightly around her. The whispers didn't return that night, but Emma didn't sleep. The next day, Emma decided to explore the attic. Something about the house unsettled her, and she hoped uncovering its history might ease her nerves. She climbed the rickety staircase, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The attic was a mess of old furniture, rotting books, and boxes covered in decades of dust. She rifled through the clutter, sneezing as she disturbed the musty air. In the far corner, hidden beneath a moth-eaten quilt, she found a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and brittle, the edges stained with what looked like dried blood. Emma opened it carefully, her fingers trembling. The handwriting inside was frantic, the ink smudged in places. As she read, her stomach churned. The journal belonged to Elias Crow, the man who had built the house. The entries told a horrifying tale of seances, rituals, and something Elias referred to as the door. "They came through the door. I thought I could control them, but I was wrong. They whisper to me now, calling me to join them. I fear it is too late. They are hungry." The final entry was scrawled in large, jagged letters. "The house is alive. It feeds on us. Do not stay. Do not let it take you." Emma slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in short gasps. She stumbled back, knocking over a stack of books. One of them fell open, and an old photograph fluttered out. She picked it up with trembling hands. It showed a family, Elias, his wife, and their young daughter. But in the background, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing by the window. Emma dropped the photo and fled the attic. That evening, Emma told Luke about the journal. He dismissed it as nonsense, a product of the paranoid ramblings of a man who had spent too much time alone. "It's just a story," he said, unpacking a box of tools. "The house is old. Of course, it has a weird vibe." Emma wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. That night, the whispers returned. They began faintly, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but grew louder and more distinct. By midnight, they filled the room, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Emma sat up, clutching the flashlight. "Luke, wake up!" Before he could respond, the bedroom door slammed shut. Luke jumped to his feet, fumbling for his own flashlight. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, the temperature plummeted, their breaths visible in the freezing air. The walls began to tremble, the floorboards creaking as though something massive was moving beneath them. And then they appeared. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms translucent and distorted. They surrounded the couple, their hollow eyes filled with malice. Emma screamed as one of the figures reached for her, its skeletal fingers brushing her arm. It felt cold, so cold that her skin burned where it touched her. Luke grabbed a hammer from the tool bag and swung wildly at the figures, but his efforts were useless. The hammer passed through them as though they were made of smoke. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. "You should have left. You cannot leave now." The figures closed in, their twisted faces inches from the terrified couple. One of them reached out, its hand wrapping around Luke's wrist. He cried out in pain as black veins spread up his arm, the skin cracking and oozing blood. "Run!" he shouted, shoving Emma toward the door. She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave you. Go!" Emma ran, stumbling down the stairs as the whispers followed her. The front door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard she pulled. Behind her, Luke's screams echoed through the house, sharp and agonized. Then abruptly they stopped. The house fell silent. Emma turned, her back pressed against the door. The figures were gone. The only sound was her ragged breathing. "Luke," she whispered. From the top of the stairs, a voice answered. "I'm here," but it wasn't Luke's voice. Emma's heart froze as she heard the voice from the top of the stairs. It was a mockery of Luke's tone, distorted and hollow, as though a broken instrument was trying to play his voice. She didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the staircase, her breath shallow and trembling. "Luke," she whispered again, her voice cracking. The figure descended slowly. At first, in the dim light, it looked like Luke, his height, his broad shoulders. But as it stepped closer, the illusion shattered. Its face was wrong. The features were stretched too far, its smile unnaturally wide. Its eyes were empty, black pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. Emma backed away, her hands scrabbling behind her for the door handle. She pulled desperately, but the wood wouldn't budge. The thing wearing Luke's face tilted its head, its neck cracking loudly. "Why are you afraid? Don't you know me?" Emma screamed as the figure lunged toward her. She ducked, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and bolted down the hallway. The walls seemed to close in as she ran, the whispers now deafening, overlapping and chaotic. "Stay with us. You belong here. It's hungry." The house itself was shifting, warping around her. Doors appeared where there hadn't been any before. Hallways stretched impossibly long, and the floor beneath her feet felt soft, almost alive. She stumbled into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind her and shoving a chair under the knob. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she scanned the room for anything she could use to defend herself. Her eyes fell on a drawer, and she yanked it open, grabbing a large butcher knife. The whispers quieted, and for a moment, the house was eerily still. Then the pounding began. The kitchen door shook violently, the wood splintering as something slammed against it from the other side. Emma gripped the knife tightly, her hands slick with sweat. The door burst open, and the figure stepped inside. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Emma raised the knife, her voice trembling. "Stay back!" The figure didn't stop, its head twisted unnaturally, its empty eyes locking onto hers. In a surge of adrenaline, Emma charged forward, plunging the knife into the figure's chest. It staggered, but no blood came from the wound. Instead, a thick, black liquid oozed out, reeking of decay. The figure laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made Emma's skin crawl. It grabbed her wrist with an icy hand, squeezing until the knife clattered to the floor. "You can't hurt us," it whispered. "You're already ours." The floor beneath Emma's feet began to shift, the wood splintering and cracking. She looked down and saw dark, skeletal hands emerging from the floorboards, reaching for her. She screamed, pulling away with all her strength, but the hands were relentless. They wrapped around her ankles, dragging her down. The floor opened up beneath her, revealing a black, swirling void filled with faces, twisted, screaming, and desperate. Emma clawed at the walls, her nails breaking as she tried to hold on. The void pulled her deeper, the hands climbing her body like spiders. She screamed Luke's name, even though she knew he was gone. The last thing she saw before she was swallowed by the darkness was the figure standing over her, its wide, grotesque smile never faltering. And then she was gone. The house returned to silence, the whispers fading into the walls. The floorboards repaired themselves, the walls straightened, and the rooms grew still. By morning, the house looked the same as it always had, worn, quiet, and abandoned. The villagers noticed the absence of the new couple, but said nothing. They knew better. The for sale sign returned to the front yard 2 weeks later. Its letters faded but legible. A real estate agent arrived, cleaned the house, and left brochures in the local diner. Another couple drove into town a month later, eager to see the charming old house by the forest. And the house waited, patient and hungry.